So we've looked so far at 3 of the 6 major covenants that God has entered into with humanity. We've looked at the creational covenant with Adam and Eve. We've looked at Noah's covenant, where really God entered into covenant not simply with Noah, not simply with Noah's family, but as God says, with every living creature. Right? This is such a beautiful moment when we see God's heart, not just for human beings, but for animals and for the entire created order. We then stopped and we looked at the covenant with Abraham, the beginning of the birth of God's people, the first moment where the nation of Israel, as they're going to be called very soon after, comes into being, all through God's covenantal relationship with this faithful man, Abram. Where we're turning now is to the 4th major covenant that God enters into with humanity, specifically the Sinai covenant. Many people call this the Mosaic covenant, but I think it's better to term it the Sinai covenant, because it's not that God's entering into covenant just with Moses. It's that with Moses' help, God is entering into covenant with all of Israel at Mount Sinai. So the Sinai covenant is our 4th covenant that we'll be looking at in Scripture of the 6 major covenants of God. We've looked at about 2 or maybe 3 principles under each of the covenants so far. I want to look at 5 major principles that we can discern from this Sinai covenant. It takes up a lot of the first 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament. A lot of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and even Deuteronomy, which the book of Deuteronomy is almost like one long covenant renewal document. It's fascinating when it's read in the light of covenant, that book of Deuteronomy. So the five themes I want us to look at in connection with the Sinai covenant are these. First, the theme of God's love and mercy and grace. It's going to be a good place to start, because that's always where Scripture starts in relationships with God. It's always about God's love coming to us first, not us turning towards God first. God always coming to his people and then asking for them to respond. So we'll start with something about the love of God. We'll then turn to something about the testing that God's people always have to experience. We'll talk a bit about covenant testing, why it's necessary, and how it actually factors into this Sinai covenant when the people of Israel, or pre-Israel, Abraham's children, are tested. Then we're going to look at the nature of this covenant. This is a unique covenant. It's going to be conditional in nature. Most of the other covenants we've looked at, Noah's covenant, Abraham's covenant, eventually David's covenant, which comes after the Sinai covenant, those are all unconditional. But this one's conditional. And that's going to say something interesting about the people that God's covenanting with, and how God decides in his wisdom whether to enter into an unconditional covenant or a conditional covenant. Thirdly, or maybe fourthly, we're going to look at the law. What we call the Old Testament law are really just the terms of this Sinai covenant. We'll have to explore the law for a bit. What we think about the law as Christians, what really is going on in Scripture about the law, and how we need to think about the law with regard to our covenant with Jesus in this day of age. And finally, we're going to look at the fact that this covenant, the Sinai covenant, was broken by the people of Israel almost as soon as it was made. And that God, in his mercy, renews that covenant. Even though they chose to break it, his people walking away from him, turning their back on him, God pursues them once again and renews that covenant with his people. So the 5 themes that we'll look at in connection with the Sinai covenant. The first one, the priority of the love of God. And here I just want to start with the fact that before any covenant happens at Mount Sinai, what first happens is the Exodus. God coming to his people in bondage. They've been in bondage under Pharaoh's oppressive slavery system for several hundred years. And God, in his mercy, it says that he remembers his covenant promise to Abraham to be faithful to his descendants, and in remembering that, and it's not like God forgot, it's just that remembrance is a covenant term. Whenever we see the idea of remembering or God remembering his promises, what it's simply signaling is that God's about to act on the promises that he's made in the past. And so it says God remembered his promise and his people in slavery, and he sends Moses now to bring a word of deliverance to them. The point is this: before God ever enters into covenant with anybody, God always first acts towards us, demonstrating his love, his faithfulness, and his provision. Before we ever ask the Israelites to covenant with him at Sinai, he first brings them out of bondage through the Exodus, brings deliverance through his love before he asks for a response from us. What God's doing is he's showing us his faithfulness before he asks us to trust in his faithfulness. God never asks for blind faith. He never does. Why? Because God always first demonstrates that our faith in him is not blind. It's rooted and grounded in his acts of love, his demonstration of faithfulness. This is just the pattern of God. Exodus comes before the covenant at Sinai. Just like Jesus coming and living and dying for us comes before God asks us to trust in Jesus. Jesus' love comes first. Then we're asked to respond in trust. This is the pattern of God, showing us first his love and faithfulness, and then asking us to trust in that. And so Israel responds. They follow Moses, and they experience the Exodus, this miraculous deliverance through the Red Sea and delivered from Pharaoh's armies. And once they're free of this oppressive land, they're at the edge of the wilderness now. And it's interesting what happens next. It says that God takes them on a 3-month journey through the wilderness, down the Sinai Peninsula, to the place of Mount Sinai. 3-month journey. Now what happens during this 3 months? And why a 3-month journey? The text says that God led them through the wilderness so that he would know what's in their hearts. Here's a principle of covenant. Human beings, we as human beings, never really know whether we're faithful to our covenant partners, whether we really love our covenant partners, until our love is tested in some way. That's simply the case for human beings. We can deceive ourselves as to whether we love someone, when in fact it might not be love, it might just be very convenient for us. And the only way to know whether it's convenience or actual self-sacrificial agape love is when something about our situation with our covenant partner tests our heart to see which is which. Now with God, he knows that in this world, all you have to do is let people experience the difficulties of life, and those difficulties will provide moments of testing. And so God leads Israel through the wilderness, and of course they experience life in the desert, life in the wilderness. In the wilderness, you're going to be thirsty. In the wilderness, there's not a lot of abundant food, so you're going to be hungry. In the wilderness, you're going to be threatened by things. Life in the wilderness is not easy. So all God has to do is take his people through the wilderness and see how they respond to the difficulties of life. Whether they continue to trust God, or whether they start to resist and grumble and complain and eventually reject God. Now, the record of Israel's 3-month journey, 3 months of testing, is found in Exodus 16, 17, 18, those 3 chapters. And it turns out that the common pattern that they experience is that they'll meet a testing moment. Often it's they're thirsty, and there's no water immediately in the desert. Or they're hungry, and there's no food right there. And it says that consistently, time after time, instead of trusting God for his provision, which he'd already showed them he's faithful for, instead of trusting him, they begin to lose faith in God. They grumble. They complain. They turn to Moses and say, "Why did you lead us into the wilderness only to die of thirst?" They even ask to go back to Egypt, the very place of their bondage. They basically demonstrate that their hearts are not faithful. They're not full of faith. Rather, they're full of unbelief, skepticism, the unwillingness to trust in God's faithfulness, even though He's already demonstrated His faithfulness through the Exodus. This is the challenge that God faces with this nation now. There are going to be other moments of testing for these people. The first is the 3-month journey to Sinai. They're going to be tested again at Mount Sinai. And that test isn't going to go so well either. And finally, even after Mount Sinai, they're going to be tested for 40 years in the wilderness. Because of their lack of faith, they have to journey for many, many years in the wilderness, and all through that period, God even giving them another chance to trust in Him. And once again, generally there's this lack of faith in God. Once they get into the 40-year journey in the wilderness, heading towards the promised land, but when God gets them there, even then they refuse to enter the land because they don't trust that God will protect them from the large people, the enemies that live in the land. And so once again they grumble, complain, demonstrate that they just don't trust God. And God has to, at that point, send them back into the wilderness to learn more lessons. And eventually it turns out they don't learn their lessons, and it's their children who finally come into the promised land. In the wilderness, 3 things keep turning up as the ways their unfaithfulness is manifested. 3 ways they keep refusing to trust God. The first is they keep refusing to trust God for His provision. Just like the 3-month journey, so the 40-year journey, they continue to not trust God for food, for water, for the basic provisions of life. They don't trust God's goodness. They question His character and His provision. Secondly, not only do they not trust God, they turn to other gods. They start falling into idolatry on a regular basis. The principle here being, instead of trusting God, they turn to the idols and the other false gods of whatever cultures are around them. And thirdly, they don't trust God's authority. In this case, it was Moses and Aaron. And instead of trusting that God's working through Moses and Aaron, and the text says that Moses was the most humble man on the earth, so a humble servant leader, instead of trusting them, oftentimes people will rise up and try to take their position over, really rejecting God and His authority. Now, God reminds them over and over that these are the 3 problems. They're to avoid these 3 ways of resisting God. In fact, when God has them build the Ark of the Covenant, He puts 3 objects in the Ark of the Covenant. And of course, the Ark of the Covenant goes right in the Holy of Holies and is the very place where God's presence is pictured by the Israelites as residing, right in the Holy of Holies over the Ark of the Covenant. Now, what's in the Ark? Just 3 things. 1, a piece of manna, that miraculous bread that God would provide for them in the wilderness so they would not go hungry. In other words, God's saying, take a piece of the miracle bread that I gave you so you'll remember you can trust me for your provision. Secondly, He puts the stone tablets in the ark. These are the tablets in which the terms of the covenant are written on them, the 10 Commandments. What's this to remind them? That they are God's people, that this is their covenant with God, and they're not to turn to other gods and idols. That's adultery. And finally, God says, put Aaron's staff into the Ark of the Covenant to remind them that God gets to choose His leadership structure and His authority, and that He chose Moses and Aaron, not someone else like Korah, a man who tried to rebel against Moses and Aaron. So 3 things to help them remember. Manna, to remember you can trust me. The tablets, to remember you're in covenant with me, not other gods. And Aaron's staff, to remind them that they're to simply trust in the authority structure God has given them. And yet these are the same 3 things they continue to forget, to resist, to break covenant with God over. testing. It's a part of human life, and in our lives, it's an opportunity for us to remember the lessons learned by Israel. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10 that the history of Israel is written in the Old Testament for us to learn from. And this is a wonderful place for us to take one lesson from, that in our testing, when we find ourselves in testing times in life, that holding on to faith in God, to not turning to false gods that our culture offers us, is going to be crucial to maintaining our covenant with Jesus.